What is the scariest story you know that is 100% true? Chiruader says, Nishabur train disaster is something that reminds me how death can come at any moment. A train with 51 wagons of sulfur, fertilizer, petrol and cotton wool somehow broke loose and rolled down the track about 20 kilometers until it derailed in the town of Khayyam, Iran. There were no humans on board. Chemical leaks ensued and authorities tried to extinguish whatever fires broke out. At one point, the whole thing explodes. And it really explodes. The whole town of Khayyam is literally demolished, 3 nearby towns are badly damaged and it was heard 70 kilometers away. The wreckage continued to explode for several days after. Around 300 people died and more than that injured. An earthquake of 3.6 on Richter scale was produced. Saganik says, I would call it creepy more than scary, but my mom's friend had a small house and lived alone. She noticed weird things, a batch of soup depleting faster than usual, missing eggs, damp towels in the hamper when she hadn't used any, extra dishes in the dishwasher, etc. This went on for months. She thought she was just being forgetful. One day she heard some thumping around in her attic and went to investigate. She found some makeshift living quarters. Small radio, hot plate, sleeping bag, pillow, food wrappers, etc. She called the cops who came to keep an eye on the place. They ended up catching a homeless man climbing a tree, trying to sneak into her attic window. He had been doing this almost daily. He would wait for her to go to work, then go downstairs and help himself to food and amenities. The funny part about this story is they got to know each other throughout the ordeal, and the guy was actually very respectful, just down on his luck. She didn't press charges, instead, let him move in, helped him get a job, and he lived in the attic until he got back on his feet. Creepy shit with a happy ending. Jenny 010137 says, the 1904 Cincinnati Privy disaster. In 1904, 9 schoolgirls drowned in an outhouse after the floor collapsed. They literally drowned in human waste. Oxidias says, my mom was driving, and a guy ran out in the road, so she stopped so she couldn't hit him. It was nighttime, so it was pretty dark out, and 3 other men emerged from the forest around, all trying to use the door handles of her car to get in. She locked them luckily, and gassed it to the nearest town. Remember to always lock your car after you start it, because if it wasn't unlocked, who knows what would have happened to her. Big Battle says, my friend's boss bought an Audi A4 convertible, back when they were new and interesting. One of the talking points was the pop-up roll hoops that were hidden unless you rolled it. A few months after buying it, he got to test those roll hoops out, as he lost control and skidded down a steep bank about 10 meters, approximately 35 feet deep. The roll hoops did their job, and he survived with just cuts and scratches from the bushes he'd plowed through. The car ended up the right way up and he got out, walked back up the bank to the side of the road, then got on the phone to the police to report the accident. While he was standing there, a driver from a car that had seen the accident came over to speak to him. Approaching from behind, the other driver asked if he was okay. My friend's boss turned around to reply and dropped dead. His neck had been fractured, but was in one piece right up until he turned his head, when it severed his spinal cord. Willow of the River says, various torture murders are probably the most horrific things I've read about. Junko Furuta, who was a perfectly normal girl until she was kidnapped off the street by a gang for no reason, purely wrong place, wrong time, according to Japanese sources, and unimaginably raped and tortured to death over 44 days. Kiki Camarena, a DEA agent in Mexico who was kidnapped by the Guadalajara cartel and tortured to death over about 3 days. His story is the central focus of the show Narcos, Mexico, but from what I've read, his death was even more brutal than what they make it out to be. A detail consistent in both is that they brought in a doctor to revive him numerous times when he got too close to death, and keep him conscious so he couldn't pass out from the pain. Kelly Ann Bates, who was groomed from a young age by a scumbag who eventually killed her slowly over the course of about a month in their apartment. Her injuries were so horrific the jury at the guy's trial had to get counseling. For example, her eyes were missing and there were stab wounds in the sockets. Sylvia Likens, whose parents left her in the care of a woman who both personally and with the help of her children and their friends degraded, tortured, and killed over several months. The Hello Kitty murder in China, where a man and his about 13-year-old girlfriend kidnapped a prostitute who had supposedly stolen from him, even though sources say she had paid him back with interest, tortured her to death, and then stuffed her corpse into a Hello Kitty toy. Baby Brianna, a newborn whose mother, father, and uncle tortured and raped her from the second they brought her home from the hospital until the second she died. Baby P, a British toddler whose mother let her boyfriend torture him to death. His back was broken in his last days of life. Honestly, there are just so many horrifically on par with each other, you could list them all day. Rickson20 says, Artemis Pyle, the drummer from Lynyrd Skynyrd, survived a plane crash and walked to a nearby house only to be shot by the homeowner. The homeowner saw a bloody long-haired man and winged him. Pyle survived that as well and made a full recovery. Leatherstrap309 says, I work at a max security prison and we have several inmates who are severely mentally ill. The ones that self-harm wear a Fitbit kind of thing to monitor heart rate. If there is a change, we rush their room to stop whatever is happening. On top of this, we also do visual inspections. On one round, a coworker was doing cell checks and noticed this particular inmate had blood on their face, but nothing came up on the monitors or anything. So he called to the inmates to ask if they were okay. The inmate had their eyes closed and just kept repeating, "It doesn't hurt." The inmate would not answer where the blood was from. We opened the cell to see what the situation was, and it turns out the inmate had plucked out both of their eyes and they were laying on the floor. The inmate's HR monitor never alerted and the inmate never screamed. Paramedics said the inmate's vitals were normal and the inmate was fully responsive. Pessimisticoptimista says, when my aunt was about 16, she was working at a grocery store and had a boss in his mid-20s. One day he called the house and was begging her to sneak out and hang out with him. She was considering it because it was her boss and she didn't want to say no. My mom, who is 2 years younger than her, always gets these incredibly spot-on gut feelings. She had one that night and begged my aunt not to go out with him. Thankfully she listened to my mom and told him no, which made him really angry. He ended up going out that night and meeting another girl. He took her out to some cliffs and raped her and pushed her off. Somehow she lived through this and was able to get him sent to prison. I feel so sorry for that girl and so thankful for my mom and her gut feelings. Always trust your gut. MRCPU says, one night my son, 20 at the time, was brought home fall down drunk by his buddy James. About a year later James got another friend drunk, checked them into a hotel, killed, dismembered and ate some of him. Bonsai says, this is from South Africa. The woman is called Alison Botha and she was abducted, raped and then choked until she blacked out. She was driven into a secluded area, stabbed 30 times in the abdomen and 16 times in the throat and left for dead on the side of the road. She had to use her shirt to keep her organs inside her body and hold her head up because of a damaged muscle in her neck, and proceeded to crawl to the road where she was eventually spotted and rescued. She survived the attack and now does motivational speaking, I believe. Saywat30 says, I spent my first 10 years in New Delhi. Back then, we would find dead women, burnt with acid or set on fire, and it used to be so normal. Like, oh look, another one of those dowry cases where her family didn't pay the husband enough money so they killed her. Many years later I revisited those memories and realized how insane that actually was. I'd totally forgotten about all that. Shmoneybooboo says, Ed Kemper murdered college women because his mother worked at a college and he claims he wanted to destroy everything she loved. Then, he murdered his mother and decapitated her, raped her head and her body, set her head on a shelf and screamed at it for hours. That is the part that terrifies me. Then he murdered her best friend and turned himself in. Relaying the whole story in detail, crying. Uoirdrum says, I worked for U-Haul when I was 18 and it was located in front of a club that was known for being really sketchy. I came in to open one morning and it was common for people to knock on the door hoping to get in early and get their truck. On this day, I hear frantic knocking on the door. I'm there alone still, so it kind of startled me. I look and there's a woman, completely naked, covered in what looks like blood. I called the cops and grabbed one of the moving blankets and went outside to cover her up. She smelled really bad and was a mess. Ended up being blood and her own shit she was covered in. Found out later she was drugged at the club that night, early morning, raped and left blacked out in the alley. It was just a fucked up and surreal situation to be involved in. Casual Blair says, guy goes into a small building and dies. Later, investigator shows up and sees the body, calls 911 and then dies. Paramedics show up to help them, then die. The reason? Oxygen levels at head height were normal. Oxygen levels when bent over was basically zero. Bending over in this room killed 4 people by asphyxiation. They could breathe. The air they were breathing contained no oxygen. The human body can't tell the difference, Handevdalimer says. I was in a crappy motel, the room had bed bugs. I was too exhausted to go to the front desk. I just needed to make it until the morning. I slept in the tub. Hours later I hear someone breaking through the window. I had a big knife with me and ran out into the room to find a man halfway through my window. We stared for a while at each other in shock. I think we both were scared. Then he says, "Is this your room?" I am like, "Yes, this is my room, man." More staring, then he slowly starts backing out while cursing me for leaving my window unlocked and not expecting him to break in. Motel on Watt Avenue, Sacramento. Thaddeus Mccoy says, old janitor from high school, friendly Ecuadorian man who went by Ping. Worked at the school for 20+ years and nobody had a problem with him. He guess his wife was leaving him and in the process of moving out he caught her in bed with her new man. Next day, in the middle of town, he opened fire on her, the man, and then killed himself before any cops had time to respond. The legend of Micah says, not as scary as some of the stories here, but I was pretty horrified when my dad told me the story. There are some really big houses in the woods in my hometown. One of the owners went out drinking with his buddies and realized he forgot the key to the gate when he got home. So he decided to just climb the gate. While climbing in his drunken state he slips and his leg gets pierced by one of the spikes on the gate. He was hanging there but too afraid to call for his wife. Since he was sure she would just open the automatic gate from inside the house, and since it was one of those gates that slides to the side, it would just rip his leg off if she did. He was hanging there the entire night until his wife woke up, saw him and called the fire department. My dad, who is one of the firefighters that showed up, said they had to saw the spike to get him off. Just imagine hanging from your own gate all night not being able to call for help. Taco Like Swede says, my friend tripped and fell onto the tracks, landing his face onto the third rail. We kinda stood there in absolute shock because we thought he was dead, but then he said, "Can I move? Will I be electrocuted?" We told him to move instantly and he did. We got him off the tracks, and no less than 2 minutes later a train went zipping by. I think the third rail turned on seconds after his face came off of it. I know that's not scary to a lot of people, but to me it was because I would have lost a close friend back when I was about 12.